Hello, viewers. Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about issues that impact social justice locally and globally. Apology, right now, Azan Hotse, it's right now in Bangladesh, and that in that context. I will try to cover it anyway. So, the Alliance consists of a group of academics, activists, artists, writers, poets, and professionals of various backgrounds from around the world who deeply care about protecting and promoting the rights of marginalized groups. We take an active interest in social justice and equity issues. Our goal is to engage in critical conversations that initiate actions to build the global solidarity needed for social justice and make the world a more equitable, kind, and compassionate place. So, before we go into the conversation, one of the objectives, that we actually engage in this kind of conversation is, how do we talk about things in a very everyday language, everyday conversation, right? So today we have with us Suprova Tasneem. I know Suprova for we go a long way back when Suprova was in high school, but now she's a journalist. Has gone through substantial academic training herself. Has lived in other country. Now I will have a lot of opportunities to learn a lot from Suprova. Suprava is a journalist based in Bangladesh. But data money for me, I get a little, geeky and childish. That Suprava has a bachelor's in economics and political science and international studies from University of Warwick, UK, and MA in social policy and development from London School of Economics. Wow, that's a lot of training, an impressive training, I gotta say.
Could have to be, but thank you for saying that.
um, and uh, and then Shuprabha, I know that money is like we have you have a lot of commitments, but thank you very much for making some time for us.
No, I mean it's really nice to see such a familiar face after such a long time, first, sir. So thank you for having me. I hope it's okay that I still call you sir. Old habits. I don't think I can get rid of that.
Yeah.
Since you were my teacher.
Uh, do you want to say to our audiences, like, what does, obviously, why do we call people sir, in our cultural context? Do you want to say a little bit about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, once you get used to calling someone that, especially in school, like, because in our culture, being a teacher is such a respectable position. It doesn't matter if you're a school teacher in a village or in the best private school in the city, it's a position of respect. And I think when you start calling someone sir or ma'am or teacher or whatever, it's really hard to break out of it. And I don't think we should break out of it because I actually think I think it's a nice culture, like especially if you want to say it. If you're being forced to say it, that's different. But I think it's a good way to kind of acknowledge these relationships of respect and trust.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, one of the things that I need to do for a lot of my Canadian friends is that basically, in Canada, we don't even call the professors like sir, right? We call
Oh,
them by name, right? Yeah,
struggled with that so much when I
yeah.
was
So
sir.
I'll tell you a funny story. Before we begin. So I when I went to Brock, I'm in Canada at my university. I was working as a graduate teaching assistant, research assistant. So I was teaching. Teaching was part of my work there. So one day I was walking in the corridor. Somebody from behind calls me Firoz sir, and I was thinking nobody calls me Firoz sir here. And then I looked around and I found one of my old students. And I'm not gonna lie, it sounded so niche, like it's like I mean, it's like understanding where we come from.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. So I need to explain that to particularly people who are not from our culture, to explain that
yeah.
why this
Sounds
sir,
very weird.
it's not actually siring. It just explains kind of relationship that has been there. um, Shubhra, I want to be, so today our conversation is about domestic violence in Bangladesh, in obviously how pandemic has impacted it. But before we get into the discussion, I would like to know that how growing up in Bangladesh, how did you come to view the gender relationships or understanding the social realities of women who are different, as opposed to men?
I think in every country, every, social, economic background in the world, there is always very early on, girls or women do understand the differences. Even it is something as simple as, being given different toys when you're a child, or, I don't know if you remember in our school, but this is something that, and again, I'm just saying this from personal context. Obviously, it's very different for different people, but in our school, they used to, remember in the sports classes, they used to take all the boys out in the fields to play football and cricket, and the girls would always be confined on campus. They would never be taken out anywhere, because I don't know why, because I don't know, the girls needed to be protected or whatever. So just so early on in our lives, these differences are like pushed on us, and it happens for, I mean, again, I'm talking from like a position of privilege, right? Where I experienced it differently, but in different contexts, a lot of girls don't get access to education in the same way. They don't get access to the same opportunities in the same way. They look at how their mothers are treated at home as opposed to the role that their fathers play at home. And just in so many different ways, I think like very, very early on, it's very clear what these sort of traditional gendered roles are in society.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a wonderful documentary by a professor of gender studies, Sarj Ali. When I first saw the documentary, that how there are so many codes, there are so many, ways of actually, socializing um, female children that they get to know pretty early on that they are girls. Um, Now, let's try to get into the discussion topic today. Uh, what do you think that what are some of the psychological and social reasons specific to Bangladesh that is behind domestic violence or gender violence in Bangladesh? In your experience as a journalist or in anecdotal experience, like people that you have known or stories that you have heard from different places.
In one word, I would
Mm.
just say patriarchy. Like, it's just, it affects men as much as it affects women, which a lot of us don't really acknowledge. So, just the first thing from very early on is that men, distance themselves from communicating or connecting in a specific way. Um, Men and women just emotionally, they are taught to be different, and men look at women as property. So, I mean, that is also something that's very embedded in patriarchy. So, when you think like the sort of domestic violence that starts early on, which is, as a child, for boys and for girls, even though I would say that is still gendered violence because it's about, victimizing someone who's vulnerable,
Mhm.
it's always this sort of ownership that I own this person, I'm responsible for their upbringing or whatever, so I can do whatever I want with them. And the patriarchy allows men to think of their wives or the partners in the same way. And I think on top of that, when you add a conservative society, um, and I don't necessarily mean like religiously conservative, but maybe social and cultural values that are conservative. We can talk about that a bit more later, but I think especially in recent years, there's kind of been, in many places, there's a sort of rejection of more liberal values as being foreign and Western, even if they are totally based on local practices and they're being put forward by local activists. But at the same time, there's kind of an embracing of like exported, more radical religious viewpoints from the Middle East. And I think all of these factors together really just add to the patriarchy, it makes it just more concrete, more strong. But the other thing I think that makes it so acute, the problem, is the fact is that it's just so easy to do it, no one in our culture, no one still thinks that it's not okay to beat your children, in most places people still think it's okay to beat your wife. And it's not just, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking it's just the uneducated, the people who don't know better, but that's not true. It happens across all classes, all societies, right? I mean, the most well-known case in Bangladesh is the case of the teacher, the academic from DU, who was beaten so badly by her husband that she lost her eyesight, and that became like a huge, like a huge debate. It was in the news a lot, but things like this happen all the time. And the sad thing is in Bangladesh, we actually have the Domestic Violence Act, the Domestic Violence Prevention and Protection Act. It came into being in 2010, I think. And, feminists will tell you it is actually a crowning achievement. It's a very compact law, it's a really good law. It doesn't just include physical violence, it talks about mental abuse, it talks about like taking away economic independence can also be a form of abuse. It has all of these things that are set out in the law, but so rarely are they implemented because people don't consider that they can take recourse to the law in cases of domestic violence. And because nothing ever happens, it just continues as is.
Yeah, I mean, I had the honor and privilege to meet Romana in Canada. She's pursuing her PhD in University of British
Yeah.
Columbia now, which is like so incredibly inspiring. And there's a wonderful documentary. I think anyone in Bangladesh actually should consider watching it. It's called The Untying the Knot. That is, teasing apart the socioeconomic and psychological different matters in Bangladesh. What perpetuates domestic violence and continues to perpetuate domestic violence, and saying that it is not okay. In a recent, I have mentioned this in a couple of times, and I find it incredibly inspiring. That's why I'm repeating it again. Um, one of the women that I know in Bangladesh, very strong and independent woman, successful woman in her personal and professional life. She wrote that in a conversation with a family member who was blaming the education, the higher education for women, to be one of the reasons why the divorce rate has spiked so high. So this woman that I'm referring to, she was saying it's good that the divorce rate has gone high. It's good that it is an evidence that a lot of women are not putting up with it, deciding that not to be in an abusive relationship. Yeah. I know this is something that will not easily be digested by probably majority of us, particularly we the men.
I think the other
Uh,
thing is that
mhm,
it is very much about power as well. And I think it says a lot about how powerless a lot of people can
mhm,
also feel because
mhm,
violence and all sorts of violence, especially rape,
mhm,
is always about power.
mhm, mhm.
And during the pandemic, all over the world, people have started talking about how there's more domestic violence, right? There used to
সুপ্রভা,
be one.
তোমার কথা শোনা যাচ্ছে না, একটু সাউন্ডটা বাড়াবা প্লিজ, মানে if you যদি একটু দেখো সাউন্ডটা, if you let's take a second and then সাউন্ডটাকে ম্যাক্স করে দাও।
Is that better?
আর একটু বাড়াও, মানে সাউন্ডটা তোমার কম্পিউটার ল্যাপটপের যেই সাউন্ডটা আছে সেখানে ইফ ইউ ক্লিক অন দ্য মাইক সেখানে একটু বাড়াই নাও।
It's at its highest now.
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, এটা কি মানে আর ইউ ইউজিং ম্যাক অথবা উইন্ডোজ?
Mac.
ম্যাক ইউজ করছো, রাইট? তো
Right.
ইফ ইউ গো অন দি টপ, exam preferences, sorry, okay, output level, আচ্ছা। তো ওকে, ওটা ওই যে তুমি যদি ওখানে ক্লিক করে সাউন্ড প্রেফারেন্সে যাও, sound preference gale. I'm sorry, so sorry.
You
But,
don't
I really want us to. হ্যাঁ
how
বলো।
technically inept I am right now.
No, I mean,
Really.
that's I can hear her fine. Okay, acha. Okay. Oh, acha. I'm really impressed. তোমার বাড়িতে কথা মনে আছে কিনা দেখো। Thank you for bringing someone as knowledgeable as Suprova Tasneem on your show. You have and
I don't
another
know,
one.
lifelong
So,
cheerleader.
wow.
You know who these
So,
people are,
yes,
right?
yeah. So I'm excited, that we have a lot of supporters here today. আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, so I was wondering যে আমাকে যেহেতু বলতেছে সাবিকুন বলতেছে she can hear right, so maybe আমার সাউন্ডের সমস্যা আছে, as long as I could hear, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone could hear.
Okay.
হ্যাঁ, তুমি যেটা বলতেছিলা, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say that the reason that all over the world there has been a lot of talk about domestic violence increasing during the pandemic, right? Because people are losing their jobs. There's a lot of economic contracting like all over the world, and it's having an impact at home. And I think that really shows how much violence is about power, because when people feel powerless, when they are not in control of kind of the external things in their lives, they come home and they try to regain that sense of power by abusing, or it doesn't always necessarily just become physical violence. It can be a lot of psychological torture as well, which translates into this feeling of being powerful and important that they're missing elsewhere.
Um, we will go into even further discussion that basically what are the other socioeconomic reasons behind the gender-based violence, and also in how its connection to pandemic. I'm sure you were surrounded. There are so many strong women that you have known in your life that you look up to, and you see they're independent and successful. In their personal, professional, emotional, spiritual life. What are some of the attributes that you have seen in women who have had that kind of strength in their or kind of resolve, that help them to overcome a lot of the societal barriers and difficulties and establish themselves?
Um, I personally don't really subscribe to the view. I'm not saying, I know that you're not necessarily saying that, but I don't subscribe to the view that there is anything innately in women that makes them survivors or successes. I mean, no, there's a whole nature versus nurture debate that's been happening for a really long time. But I think it's true that I am definitely surrounded by women, all the time at work, at home, in friend circles everywhere who have, I meet a lot of women in my work who've just encompassed like amazing odds. And I think if anything, the thing that it shows us is that, you know, in every individual's life, there are social and economic hurdles, right? There are obstacles that they have to overcome. But for women, the hurdle of just their sex, just the obstacle of being a woman, full stop, is still a barrier that is so high that people have to put in a lot of effort to try and overcome it. And in many, many cases, it's impossible to overcome that without being lifted up, whether it's, a parent who supports your endeavors, or, a job that gives you economic independence, or working with a rights organization that empowers you in some way. But that's, for me, that's the main thing, that it shows that it's still so difficult, even in the 21st century, being a woman, that you just have all these added things that you have to overcome to get where you want to get.
That is absolutely true. Um, I personally, and I agree with you that I personally don't think or attribute that women are inherently strong or survivor. I think in many ways that is a damaging discourse. That sort of we create a kind of expectation that, oh, you will overcome this. Like, and I'm sure that in the pandemic, one of the things that we have heard from people of privilege is that, oh, people from particular socioeconomic background, they have certain ability to fight any kind of virus. Yeah,
There's
yeah,
used to adversity that they can
yeah, yeah,
overcome.
yeah. And as a student of sociology, I find it fundamentally racist. I find it just how I was bluntly racist to consider that, oh, you're poor people, you have a stronger immune system. You have, so similarly, I think that stereotypical not nature versus nurture debate. Um, Now let's go into a bit of like sociological training. That when we grow up, let's say I have seen my sisters, my mother, my amazing women in my life. Is that how they have been trained from very early on in their life to be docile, quiet, um, good, and here I quote unquote I say the word good. And I have seen a meme somewhere that good girls don't make history. So understandably, um,
Sorry, wait, you got cut off a little. I didn't
okay.
get the last part. Girls don't what?
So I have seen a meme somewhere that says good girls don't make history. Particularly, obviously, when women do stand up, when do point things, what is happening, we men don't take it easy. It creates a kind of anxiety in us, and we sort of, um, it's not easy for instance, even I don't think if I didn't have I have had almost 20 years of academic training, and I'm still in academia, very much in academia, surrounded by incredibly strong women, particularly the field of social science. You have a lot of incredibly intelligent, scholarly women to inform a lot of your consciousness. I don't think this was the kind of perception that was, I had when I was just a teenager or when I was growing up in a village. Um, in your understanding, what are some of the, um, how do I say, uh, very dangerous discourses that women or young women or girls in Bangladesh, internalize from early on, that actually creates a kind of, barrier, psychological, social, economic barrier for their progress subsequently in their life?
I mean, I think the very obvious one is that men's spaces and women's spaces are separate. You know, we've seen a lot of difference now where in 2020 there are so many more women in the economy than there were before. So clearly that has changed. But the nature of this change is also something that we should discuss because quite often women do still, I mean, they are part of the economy, but maybe necessarily not getting economic independence. Like female workers are very, very likely to be trapped in inflexible, low wage work. Um, they can be very vulnerable, have their like labor rights. Um, but so the main thing is, I feel like when we talk about this, we kind of frame the conversation wrong from the onset because there is a whole thing where we do have these things like good girls do this, bad girls do that, but even then we're making the agenda very binary because on the other side of that coin is, you know, maybe even 20 years ago, people would be like, oh, you just sit at home and look after your children. Like, you expect your husband to do all the work, as if all these sort of nurturing, like women's work is not valuable work. So, the ideal good girl, the Bengali middle class, like sort of docile, like you said, stays at home, looks after her family. Maybe that has now changed to stays at home, looks after family, but also goes out and works and is educated and etc. But if somebody chooses to just stay at home, maybe we also judge them on a different scale. So in whatever that women do, I feel like there's a lot of judgment involved. And I think the point is, we really don't question as much what good boys do or what bad boys do, so I just think this whole conversation is something that we just have to move away from because we're always putting women in boxes no matter what we do. This is your box, this is, you know we just have to acknowledge that women are not homogenous. And I know you said about, that you study sociology and there's a, a lot of discourse on this, and I'm sure you know of Chandra Mohanty, who wrote Under Western Eyes and Feminism Without Borders, and she said that we have this way of viewing third world women as always either victims or of being dependent, and we're always kind of pushing them to get out of that. But even that perception that they're always victims, that they're dependent, is is racist, because that's not true. Like, there you will find really uneducated rural women who, through that lens, kind of like a, I don't know, Western donor will look at them and think, oh, let's throw some microcredit at this woman and make her economically empowered, and we'll have done her a huge favor. But actually now she's doing like thrice the amount of work than she did before, and there's been no change in her family dynamics. So I think we just have to be really careful about putting women in boxes and talking about how they should behave and how they shouldn't behave, because the point is not to sort of we just end up putting the onus of on women, that it's up to them to change their situation, and we are not talking about the sort of structural inequalities that keep them in their position, which is a human rights issue. It's a political issue, it's not a personal issue, but we always talk about it like it's a personal issue.
Yeah, yeah, and you have very accurately brought Chandra Mohanty here. One of the things, I get from Chandra Mohanty is that when she's sort of writing to the Western, I'm going to be blunt, like white feminists, is that, you know, uh, we understand you have issues, but don't try to consider that in your lens, you are able to understand the subjectivity or the realities of the women of the other places in the world. That's where I think we need to bring in transnational feminism. You have absolutely, what's an English sentence, English phrase that hit the nail on the head. Isn't that expression like that?
I
Like
think so.
you have just said it accurately, right? And I love giving this example. Like my mother has raised 11 children, a woman who has never gone to school, college, or university, has lived and raised her children her entire life in the village, right? This woman is incredibly resilient. My mother is incredibly educated. She is incredibly innovative, creative, and otherwise, how on earth, but obviously, if you frame it, if somebody from the West, now that's one of the points that I at least I interact with my professors in Canada, that if you think that white feminism is enough to understand the subjectivity of my sister or my kala, or women in the villages where I am from, where I was born and raised, you will be very, very wrong. And obviously, a lot of the times what happens is that the Western feminism, white feminism, has a tendency of understanding the gender relationship. Oh, let us, and I'm going to be very deliberate and intentional here. Let's rescue the brown women from the brown men. But a lot of the times, white women will not essentially recognize and will look at it critically that they are also the direct beneficiary of a global capitalist system that extracts the immense amount of surplus value from a country like Bangladesh, which privileges them in so many ways, right? I mean, if you
Yeah.
look at the feminist struggle in the West, when the white women were struggling for their voting rights, the white women got voting rights way before the black women.
Yeah.
So, and this is my favorite example, that when you talk about diversity and equity issue in the West, you will see that I just had a conversation with one of your friends, Laviva. She and I were talking that whenever we talk about diversity and equity issue in the context of work sector, we say, oh well, every woman makes 85 cents to a dollar compared to what a man makes, right? But what the data says, that is if you are a white woman. Good luck if you're a black woman, wait for another 65 years. And if you're a Latina woman, wait for another more than 100 years, right? So that complication is incredibly important. So that's what I think scholars like Chandra Mohanty comes in and says, please do not generalize, do not homogenize.
But it still happens, and it's such a dangerous narrative as well. Because when the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan happened, that was
Mhm.
a narrative that they used a lot. That we need to save these poor Afghan women from these extremists who we have created, but that was ignored. And the West has, in many occasions, used this image of like the broken down, disadvantaged brown woman to make up for their policy measures, to kind of justify their measures. And it was really, to me, it was really interesting when Hillary Clinton was running for the presidency. There were, when she was campaigning to be the candidate, and there were so many, it was just, I mean, there was a lot of, I mean, we cannot discount the fact that there was a lot of hatred against her because she was a woman. But there seemed to be this kind of idolizing of her as like a role model for women. And they always said that that she's not just a role model for American women, she's a role model for women across the world. And even in Bangladesh, we were talking about that, like, oh my god, wouldn't it be amazing if there was like a woman. But thing is, this woman, said that Henry Kissinger is one of her idols, you know. This is a man who people in our country envision to be more criminal. So how can we, you know, how do we look at that person just because she's a woman and then say, oh, you know, this is who we aspire to be. Our girls should follow this model, you know. And I think we should be really careful about that. In every scenario, we should always be looking for local examples, you know. And I think for me personally, like, I think Sufia Kamal is an amazing, amazing feminist example, an idol for Bangladeshi girls to look up to. And she was a woman who was deeply, deeply religious. You know, that's very well known about her. But everything she wrote was so progressive, so secular, so, you know, pro women, pro minority. So we don't need other women from, I mean, obviously we should always learn, you know, we should have some sort of transnational solidarity. We should learn from each other, you know, feminists across the world and all of that. But we don't need to look outside because we have our idols over here.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't know if have you watched that movie Elizabeth, Kate Blanchett. I forgot her name.
There's an old one, right?
Yeah. I think in 2007 it came out. Yeah. So in that movie, I'm sorry, I'm not very good with a lot of Western actors and actresses' name. So there's a line where, and it's based on history that where Elizabeth says that I may be a woman, sir, but I can have a man's heart if I choose to, right? And obviously, we need to be very cognizant of that. The despicable brutality of British colonial domination all over the world, and if you look at, depends on what vantage point you look at, right? If you try to understand the complexity of Elizabeth, things that what she has accomplished in so many ways, and also the other kinds of oppression that has. And what's interesting is that when the story of Elizabeth gets told and retold in so many ways, right? Obviously, the psyches of even well-read, educated women, the way in their psyche that gets, the kind of impression it leaves, right? The kind of, indelible impression it has that, oh, when I think about, these strong women, right? But what's fascinating is in Nigeria, there was a revolt against the British colonial domination by women. 10,000 women got together and they revolted against the British colonial domination, because prior to the colonial time, how Nigerian women had the kind of social, freedom, to be, a part of the state, running the government and community in so many ways they had. But when the British colonial domination started, they were restricting the black women, the Nigerian women in the public sphere. I doubt that a lot of black women in the world actually grew up knowing this history, that this is what I doubt that we in Bangladesh, we know the history of Prithilata Wadder. I doubt we know the history of as you have mentioned, Sufia Kamal, Begum Rokeya, the incredibly progressive women who have made incredible contribution for the progress, for the causes of be it liberation movement, or be it the social purposes, right? Speaking of Kissinger, when you speak about Kissinger, it's like I was thinking, oh my God. I think when we think about our national history, like many countries in the world, we also suffer from the dementia, historical amnesia. Sorry, historical amnesia. Kissinger was a man who did not think that Bangladesh deserves any kind of help when we needed help, particularly food. We were going through food crisis. He said, well, we don't need to give them food, because Bangladesh is not militarily significant. There is nothing that we can gain out of that, right? We forget the fact that in 1971, what was the position of United States? United States stood against, United States choose to be silent, when the unarmed, helpless, men and women are brutally murdered by, the Pakistani soldiers, right? We forget that history pretty fast. We forget the contribution of, brave people like, Archibald, who went against, I think he's the only one in during that time who went against the government and saying against American government, and he paid the price dearly. So definitely that is a very very connected point that we have to think. Um, Also, in order to have critical consciousness, we need to have the space to have critical, education, critical conversation around history, our subjective economy, right? Being a teacher, I feel like we have a huge crisis of that. Um, I don't think education is limited to the classroom. I think the majority of it happens outside the classroom. Um, and I don't think domestic violence, the situation can improve if we don't take a critical consciousness, right? If we don't develop a critical consciousness. What are some of the reasons you would say that we are not successfully able to, and I'm not saying not everybody, but to the extent that it should have, are you satisfied to the level that we carry critical consciousness on a national level to have critical conversation, or what's actually, coming as a barrier, if you speak to it?
I think, like you said, there is a lot that could be said about our education sector. There's a huge need to decolonize education. Like you said, we do, especially in the sort of backgrounds that I've studied in. I feel like, I mean, not at all. I had some very good teachers, obviously. I had a lot of role models in my school, but it doesn't take away from the fact that we were part of an education system where, at one point in our schools, we were told that you will not speak to your friends in Bangla. You will always practice English. It was very, very not, it did not give us a sense of identity as Bengalis and Bangladeshis in any way. And I think many of my peers will tell you that they feel a great disconnect regarding their place in this country because they have spent a huge portion of their lives in an education system that prepped them to be, like emulate other countries. But I think generally throughout our education system, there is something that, and it's in our education system and it's a reflection of our society, which is a real need for obedience. Do you remember in school? I don't know if you were around at that time. We had something called Discipline Month, and whenever,
Of course, I remember. Of course, I do. Huh?
and when I look back, I just think, why did we not have Creativity Month? Why did we not have National History Month? Why did we? There were so many other things that we could have done as students, but no, we had discipline. And this is something that in our family structures, our elders expect us to obey them without asking questions. Our teachers expect us to obey them without asking questions. We graduate, we work somewhere, and our bosses expect us to obey them. And you get married, and majority of your spouses expect the same level of obedience, and their families. And finally, the state then goes on to expecting that level of obedience without asking questions from you. And I think that's why, and I think this is a discussion that's happened all over the world, right? That sort of education mass produces workers, it doesn't produce thinkers. And it's in the interests of all those in power to not produce people with a critical consciousness, because you don't want people who ask questions, you want people who do as they're told. And I think, yeah, that definitely does have an impact on gender relations. And because it's something that is so ingrained in us from when we're children, when women start to push back against this, they become victims of all kinds of violence and other prejudices because they're trying to change something that has been the status quo for a really long time.
Speaking of marriage, let's go to a little bit of um, let's go through some uncomfortable questions. um, One here, Sabikun, she always asks great question. We notice that so-called workmen in our country still prefer marrying and are married to women younger, less educated, and less financially stable than them. Is this a hypocrisy? If not, what is it really that intimidates men about confident, solvent, independent women looking to marry for love and partnership?
I mean, it is absolute hypocrisy. There's no other way of looking at it. And I think, I mean, you know, just two things. Like, I think I don't agree with, because you mentioned colonialism in those times. And I think at that time there was also, they really pushed the narrative of like the kind of barbaric brown man who's like always brutal, always like oppressing their women and things. So obviously, I don't think all men, and especially if you go to Bangladesh, for whatever reason, like if you go to the villages in Bangladesh, you will meet so many uneducated, fathers from rural backgrounds who will say, I want my daughter to go to school. And Bangladesh has a really high percentage of girls who are in primary school, right? Because people's minds are changing. So we should also be careful of always saying that all men are the same, because there are a lot of changes that are happening in our society. But what she's talking about, woke men, like men who, especially slightly more upper class privileged men who, I don't know if it's, I don't know if it's maybe they are not literate in sort of gender relations to not really understand. But I think that in a lot of cases it's just giving people a free pass. But I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that women definitely operate as the gatekeepers of patriarchy in society as well. So it's not just men who perpetuate these structures, but women as well who can do that. Maybe not consciously, but maybe also consciously. And it happens in little ways, like telling your daughter that don't go out dressed like that, but also in big ways where someone says, my son will not marry a girl who works because that means she will not be able to look after the family. So again, like patriarchy is something that both men and women are involved in the same way that the gender divide impacts men and women as well, right? Because there is a disproportionate burden on men as a result of gendered relations. Like it's so hard for women to talk about abuse, but it's almost impossible for men in our society to talk about having faced sexual violence. It's just not done, because you're a man. You will never admit to someone that something like that has happened to you, because you're not weak, you're not vulnerable. So it happens for both sexes, both of us. There's a lot of like nuance to this. And yeah, there are definitely men out there who will say, oh, I'm really progressive, but this and this, and that's not being progressive.
Yep. And our dearest Sanjaribai has asked a wonderful question. Wonderful discussion going on. Sanjaribai, thank you very much for listening to our conversation. I think men suffer a mysterious kind of inferiority complex while choosing their women as partners. Suprova, comment on that?
I mean, it's possible. Like you said, we internalize what we've seen in our families, right? So if you are used to seeing female role models where they act or behave in a certain way, and then maybe in the modern world you don't want to really be with anyone who is more educated, more out there, more economically involved. So I mean, it can happen, but I wouldn't call myself an expert on men's psychology, so I I don't know. I mean, you should answer this question, I think.
Well, just because I'm a man doesn't mean I know a lot about male psychology. I, mhm. I would say yeah, Sanjay Bhai, also totally not connected to it. But now that you're here, I don't know if I'll get your audience the other time. I have got into a PhD studying artificial intelligence and social impact of artificial intelligence. The audience, sorry, he's our dear brother, at least my brother, and I look up to him a lot. So I don't know if I'll get his audience again. So, so yeah. Going in terms of discussing that how do we what sort of things psyche that the patriarchy, the impact of patriarchy on psyche. So I'm going to go a little bit theoretical. Is that so? I'm going to connect capitalism with it. So capitalism, I often give these references. One of the wonderful books that that can help us to understand is called Golden Gulag by geographer uh, Ruth Wilson. She talks about a kind of capitalism which is called racial capitalism. So capitalism is essentially a relationship. It's not a thing; it's a relationship. And capitalism, in order to extract surplus, in order to extract profit, it needs inequality all the time. So therefore, it needs to create a hierarchy, you know, in different ways and in different categories. So one of the most successful form of hierarchy that capitalism has exploited, leveraged for doing despicable brutality and exploitation of the world was racism. So how one race could somehow claim their superiority and justify their despicable brutality on all over the world. And to this day, that happens, that operates. So we are under illusion, thinking that the Brits have left us 1947. There is no, we are done. The colonization is over. The kind of thing that we go through is called psychic colonization. So one of the wonderful authors that we can actually use in this context is Frantz Fanon, who talks about in his book, Black Skin, White Mask, is and Suprova has given references to your schooling experience going to English medium school that basically have that worked out. So in 1834, a man called Thomas Babington Macaulay gave a famous speech in British Parliament where he said that for the British colonial interest, we need a new breed of Indians who are brown in their skin but British in mind. So colonialism was very much an intellectual project. So the physical colonization of India ended or the for the most parts of the world, colonialism ended. But if you look at the colonial relationship, it's a capitalist exploitation for extracting surplus value. We are not over with globalization. We are not over with incredibly powerful organizations like United Nations, UNESCO. When we deal with these powerful countries or the economic agents, we are not in the equal footing. So how is it connected? And that also operates in our psyche when we understand the relationship between gender, right? So patriarchy, marginalizes and oppresses men equally, right? Because the moment a boy starts going to school, and so one of the things we are said, first things, you are a man, you're not supposed to feel. Men don't feel pain, right? So what happens that this kind of socialization, it separates us from our own humanity, and that is a very, very dangerous psychological impact that men carry in them. So if you look at the data that if you compare men and women, for example, if I give you the data of the United States, that every year about 40,000 people in the United States commit suicide with gun violence, die with gun violence, and more than 95% of them are white male. And there's a wonderful book about it by Jonathan Mitchell. The book's called Dying of Whiteness. So, these white men, cannot deal with life's adversity because when they're born, basically things were not as difficult for them. But later when things do turn difficult, they cannot accept it. How is it connected to gender violence? Similarly, we men, we are not very connected to our inner self. Of course we suffer from inferiority complex. Of course we think hierarchically. Of course we feel the inner urge to compete all the damn time to prove our worth. We are born with a living, breathing, thinking, amazing, being that we don't understand ourselves, but somehow we try to find our worth through our achievement, be it like material possession or institutional achievement, and so on and so forth, right? So my views are hierarchical. So imagine that I think that I deserve the right to exist because I've accomplished a certain set of achievements. I have a set of material accomplishment. That is why I deserve to live. Now that is such a impoverished perception towards me. So when I myself am oppressive towards me, and I'm separating myself from social indoctrination from childhood, from my own humanity, will I be able to treat others with compassion, care, love, and the kind of solidarity that is needed to exist a just and equitable society? No, it is not possible. So that is my take. That how I see gender violence. Suprabha.
Wow, I mean that's it's very comprehensive, and um, I think, I mean, if we are to just go back to the first thing that you said about sort of the neoliberal economy and like the sort of resource, I think the prime example of that in Bangladesh and how that affects gender is the garments industry. It's very obvious, in the sense that, and now we've had this thing where the pandemic hit us, and then so many orders got cancelled, and there is a clause in contracts. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I think it's like force majeure or something like that, which says that in the event of a natural disaster, an act of God or whatever, the contract can be void. But we had a this really bright young lady, this legal expert, write um, at to Daily Star where I work about how foreign buyers are now unjustly using this clause because they just don't want to pay for their orders, and it's not applicable if the orders have already started to be made. If there's a lot of loopholes where Bangladesh is in the right, but they are being able to arm twist us into not accepting these orders because there has never been an equal relationship. We have always been has always been like a north south sort of powerful and, how I wouldn't say maybe powerless, but less power kind of relationship. But I think the thing that we have to remember is that even during colonialism, it is not possible to have any system of oppression without local collaborators, right? And like in the garments industry as well, like, obviously we can't paint everyone with the same brush, but there are plenty of owners, factory owners out there who do not have the interests of their workers at heart. I would say a majority of them don't. And it's obvious where you will say that obvious. I mean, the Bangladeshi manufacturers are not getting in nowhere near as much profit as the foreign buyers who are actually selling these clothes. But the workers, when compared to these factory owners, are getting even less. Like they are. I've spoken to workers who, because of like contractual payments, who work, and it's so easy. Like it's supposed to be formal employment. The garments industry actually is one of the few, especially after Rana Plaza, is one of the few industries where there are like proper laws. There's supposed to be labor unions. None, they don't really function that well. There's supposed to be, there's minimum wage, there's leave and all that. But what they do is, and this happens all over the world, as I'm sure it's like a very um, critical part of the neoliberal economy, is that people are employed contractually, and those separate contracts allow them to ignore labor laws. So a woman is supposed to get 13,000 taka or something a month, but she actually ends up getting 6,000. She's supposed to get sick leave, but she doesn't get sick leave. She's supposed to get 2 days off, but she doesn't get any days off. She only gets paid if she goes into work. And I would say a huge number of women in this country are trapped in this sort of employment. So, we call this a success story. And maybe, you know, on a certain level, it definitely is a success story because at least they are earning, they have gained a certain level of financial independence. But that doesn't take away from the fact that they're exploited. But, and we're talking about women garments workers who are actually part of the formal economy. But the majority of women workers in Bangladesh are actually part of the informal economy, and that's in that economy, they are even more marginalized. They have zero rights. And, all of us, like, I'm always very aware of the fact that whenever I'm speaking about these things, I'm talking from a position of privilege. And for all of us, probably even people who might be listening to this conversation, domestic workers is something that we don't really, there's so many NGOs in the country who work on many different things, but you don't really hear a lot of people working on domestic workers. There's a Domestic Workers Welfare Act, which is supposed to implement minimum, like, working hours. It's supposed to give us minimum wage, days off, sick leave, maternal leave, a huge number of things that not a single one of us, and I am equally guilty, and not a single one of us have tried to change. Now, we can say, I can take a stand and be like, I don't believe in domestic labor. I think it's oppressive. I'm not going to have a domestic worker in my house. But that doesn't change the system. That's just me not taking responsibility for something that exists in our society. So I think there definitely is a sort of race and, like, post-colonial issues that affect gender, but we also shouldn't use it to take away from gender issues that are very real in our own country. The issue of minority women being more at risk of violence is our issue. Indigenous women being more at risk of violence is totally an issue that we have created and we need to solve. There's a big Horijon community in North Bengal who are part of, like, the Dalit community, and in Bangladesh we have laws where they get a quota because they're traditionally cleaners, right? And even in India, they're for centuries they've worked as cleaners, but obviously they don't want to be trapped in this employment forever. And it's crazy that in a majority Muslim country they are still treated in the same way. People in their communities, Muslim people, think that they're untouchables, and there's a quota in the government that gives the Horijan, the Dalit community, the first option to apply for a job. And we think of it as like, oh, we've given them the step up, but we've given them the step up to be trapped in cleaning jobs forever. And men and women do this job, but for Horijan women, like, it's so hard for them to go to school. It's almost unheard of. There's in my community in North Bengal now, there's a separate, because we had to have a separate Horijan school for these kids to actually go to school. And there's only one girl in that entire community. There's only one girl who's gone to college and is training to be a nurse. So these are also race issues that maybe, yeah, of course, there are certain colonial influences on these race issues, but they're issues that exist now for us in the 21st century that we are perpetuating. And I'm sorry, what did you were also saying something about men sort of feeling like they are
inferiority, like the internalized inferiority, and we always feel the urge of proving, that sort of, like, hierarchical ways of relating to anybody in between men and with the rest of the
yeah, I
world.
mean, I think that is the thing. Like, I think every single one of us have in some way internalized some sort of toxic masculinity, or some sort of just gender relations that we think, like, even, but it really, I think, at the end of the day, like, obviously it's up to political and legal structures to protect everyone's rights, but it is also up to every individual to decide on how much is too much for them. Like, I know I have, my cousins have had arranged marriages and they're happy with it. They're not, it hasn't made them any less empowered. And it's not a choice that I understand, but it's a choice that I accept. In the same way that, I don't know, if a woman, I have friends who love cooking, who would just happily spend the rest of their lives in their kitchen, making dishes, but that doesn't, that's also their choice. But I think the point is that everyone is able to make that choice for themselves without external influence. And the most important thing for, I think, women everywhere is that to have that level playing field when they, from a very young age, which is something that doesn't happen, I think. It's very unlikely to happen in most places.
Yep, yep. You have brought an incredibly good example in terms of the gender violence and the neoliberal economy and its influence in our the ways we live, the ways we consume, and that is where I do agree with you 100% when you said that yes, there are colonial influences. Yes, our psyche in many ways are dealing with the post-colonial hangover. That how and yes, that capitalism cannot operate uh, without co-opting the psychological apparatus. If I want to say in other words, one of the ways that we are violent towards anybody, this is one way of looking at it. I'm borrowing from an Indian original thinker philosopher Krishnamurti. He argued that people are violent towards people when they think that they are separate from them. When I see that my well-being is connected only to me, but that is an illusion, and that creates I think one of the latest books, one of the last books of Noam Chomsky, The Requiem of American Dream, where he writes that the economy, the American dream is dead, and we are still trying to sell it what's not there anymore. This socioeconomic mobility, upward mobility, you can't really do it. But there he mentions one thing, that how the neoliberal paradigm of the economy, government, culture has an impact on the rich people as well. Because it doesn't matter how hard you try, living with denial, it will take us only so far. So you have brought an incredibly good example that what is our relationship when how do we actually question our own subjectivity when we think about our domestic helps, how we actually relate to them, the garment factory workers. And that is where I think a lot of the rich conversation have had with my Western friends, that yes, it is possible for you from here to talk about the gender violence and relationship, but do you understand that you are the beneficiary of the exploitation of millions of women in Bangladesh, millions of workers in Bangladesh? So if you don't look into your complicity in that, it's just again a denial. I don't know whether there's a thing in Canada. It's called Begumpara. Uh,
I
so
think
it's
it's very much actually.
yeah. So it's I was having a conversation with a Canadian author the other day, Salma Bani. She's writing a book on it called Begumpara. So it's you have this incredibly wealthy, rich Bangladeshis living in Canada, life that you most Canadians cannot even imagine in their uh, usual imagination. I wouldn't say wildest dream, but in usual imagination. Those Begums are enjoying an incredibly privileged life at the expense of exploitation of millions of Begums in Bangladesh. And she puts it this way, right? So I think looking at that kind of relationship is incredibly important. You mentioned moments ago that in terms of violence, gender relationship, is that women can also be the gatekeeper of patriarchy. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Um, so I don't want to I don't want to refer to like very obvious stereotypes, but there in our culture there is a very obvious stereotype that you will see in all sorts of Hindi serials and whatever that people watch, right? Which is the angry mother-in-law. I think that is like it's a stereotype, but that's the easiest way to explain someone who is the gatekeeper of patriarchy, because these characters in these shows are single-handedly responsible for creating this sort of family structure where the women are nothing. They're only there at the beck and call of the men of the family, and obviously this is someone who has internalized patriarchy to such a level that they believe that that is their role in society. And I think a lot of people will say that oh, this is just a traditional mindset, this is culture, why are you hitting out at that? But from my personal experience, I can 100% say this is not true. And it's not, I come from my Dadabari is in North Bengal. And I don't know if you know any North Bengali women, but like in North Bengal, there's a stereotype like
নর্থ বেঙ্গলে কোথায়, মানে which part of
Nil,
নর্থ বেঙ্গল? হুম,
Nilphamari.
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, yes, go on.
So in Nilphamari, there's like a joke. There's like a stereotype where people say that, oh, the men are so lazy and the women always have to work all day, But there has always been this thing in Nilphamari where I've always seen my whole life that women in Nilphamari have worked in the fields always. They don't really care that much about whether their waist or their back or whatever is covered when they work. My dad's aunt, who is like a second mother to him, who didn't actually, like you mentioned your mother, she also wasn't as educated. It wasn't my direct grandmother, my daddy. She was from Borishal and she was the first female graduate from there. But my dad's aunt, she didn't study as much, but she was always out and she was always organizing. Like she was very innately, involved with like the women's political movement at the time. She was, she Mohila Porishod and all of that. She's totally outgoing. I learned all the Bangla swear words I know. I learned from her, like genuinely. She's just the most incredible woman. She's in her 80s now, and I don't think anyone will look at her and say, and she's deeply, deeply religious by the way. So, but I don't think anyone can look at her and say that she's a gatekeeper of patriarchy. But on the other hand, I've met people my age, people who are even younger than me, who have internalized this idea despite having, an English medium education, despite having all the resources at their hand. They have internalized this idea that if I am not married by the time I'm 25, I'm dead. Like I have no value to society. If I don't have children by the time I'm 28, I have no value to society. I'm just not a human being. These people are the gatekeepers of patriarchy. And I'm not saying this to say that they're bad people or anything like that, but I think we also have to acknowledge different ways that women internalize the patriarchy and act according to what these dictates tell them to do. And I know it's a fine line, because obviously you can turn around and say this is what I want, like this is what I need. But that's what makes gender relations so complicated, because it removes the veil between the public and the private sphere. Like there are so many different factors, and it's really hard to navigate these sort of influences. And the other thing that we had this, you know of Kamala Bhasin, the Indian feminist. So she came to Bangladesh and she did a talk, and one of the things that she talks about is capitalism and how it influences how women view themselves. And I don't remember her exact comment, but she said something like, the fact that you feel like you cannot leave the house without makeup, the fact that, you need to cover your face in so many products shows that you have internalized the patriarchy, and it has created your self-awareness. It has influenced your self-awareness. And I totally understand why a lot of women out there feel offended by this sort of, I don't think she meant it as an accusation, but a lot of women out there have felt offended by it, because they say we are not putting on makeup to make ourselves more acceptable to men. We're putting on makeup because it makes us feel good. And I totally understand that point of view as well. But interestingly, we had someone write in the Daily Star about how she took offense at this sort of thing that Kamala Hassan said about capitalism and how it influences women. And she said that, if I want to wear what I wear, I will do it. If I want to put makeup on my face, I will do it. And that is my right. Like that is my individual liberty. And that is what makes me a feminist. And she actually called this neoliberal feminism. I think for a lot of us, for a lot of us, neoliberalism is not a term that we would use in a positive light, but it is a neoliberal feminism is a term that a lot of people use to kind of talk about individual liberties and individual rights. And I think it's really dangerous because it totally takes away from the fact that women's rights are not personal issues. They are legal, political, social issues. They have always been, and it's very easy for women who come from backgrounds like myself to say, I will do what I want, I will wear what I want, I will go where I want, because we were born with these liberties. Like, sure, we have had to navigate our paths to try and to claim them more, but we were born with this privilege. And by making feminism so individual, so personalized, we are totally forgetting about the fact that it's a social movement, it's a political cause. And I think this this in fact is probably more dangerous than being a gatekeeper of patriarchy if you are just talking about feminism from your own economic background and not thinking about the women who don't have the voices to, for a lot of women, wearing what they want is not an issue. I mean, obviously it is an important issue, but they have bigger issues to think about, and it's also, I think, with sort of these personalized ideas about feminism, this neoliberal feminism, we just fall back into the same trap about just talking about women's bodies. We are starting this conversation where we make our rights about our bodies, and that, I think that's just perpetuating the same structure, because why are women's bodies so important? And why are we also fighting about our right to, we should just be able to do what we want with our bodies. We shouldn't make it a claim or a fight that needs to be fought.
I love this that you have strung these two words together, the neoliberal feminism. It's wonderful. Um, and I, one of my professors has asked in a class one day that who do you think that the closest relationship that you have with somebody or something, and that relationship is political. In so the answer, what she said, that your relationship with your body. So I'm giving example from the Western context, that in summertime, a woman will shave her legs, for going outside in the street, but a man will not, So I'm not, supporting or denying, this is nothing. I'm just using an example that basically how a relationship. You give example of Kamal Hashim that about makeup, right? So it's fascinating, is and also something that that worth considering. I think bell hooks comes really handy, when you look at her perspective. If so, Mashiad has given a wonderful comment that unfortunately the suffragette movement in the West itself has been tainted with racism. And I think what she's referring to, that because black men got the voting right before the women, white women, and at that time, and a lot of white women came out incredibly like racist in terms of they would rather give the right, even the quote, like even to the black men, but they will not give the rights to black women. Sorry, white women. And in the West, the gender issue and rights, and in a lot of ways, it has benefited the white women more than people of color, men of color. White women have benefited more, and obviously when it comes to white women as opposed to women of color, the difference is like huge. Um, I think neoliberalism has convinced a lot of women to believe that perhaps feminism is about freedom to wear whatever you want, wear whatever the makeup that you want. But then I had a conversation with a professor. She pointed out that feminism is not only for women, it is equally and incredibly important for men. It's about transforming social relationship. Feminism is connected to nature, that is basically what we are doing to our nature. Feminism is connected to that, how do you transform the social relationships that are oppressive. So I think the shallow understanding of feminism could somewhat also be like all man hating. Like if you are a feminist, you are obligated to hate men. If you
I
are,
think that men hate the feminists out. I really don't think. I think the man hating feminist is angry feminists totally just something that
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you and I. I'm sorry. I'm saying the same thing in what you were saying, but I couldn't articulate it better. It's- it's not so simple. It's not like, oh, feminism means. Um,
I think it
I mean,
means something different for everyone, you know. That's where the thing that you said about, yeah, being for men as well. Like when you were a child, do you remember anyone telling you that "Chele der katte hoy na, boys don't cry"? You know, I think that this the phrase "boys don't cry" for me is just enough to explain why men also need feminism, because it's true that from a young age, boys are also conditioned to ignore their emotional sides. They're not taught to communicate. They're discouraged to communicate. And, you know, the patriarchy conditions men to become the sort of men who will perpetuate the patriarchy, right? So that's why feminism is probably, I always tell people that there are so many female feminists, but more than anything, what we need are for men to be feminists, because you can't just, you know, we women will always be negotiating for their spaces. They will always be claiming their rights. But if we just have half of the population who believe that it's not important, that they don't matter, then we're never going to get anywhere. So more than anything, men need to have a feminist education than anything else.
I agree with you 1,000,000%. I would say that if I just purely look at the anecdotal experiences or my own direct experiences in having this conversation, I think obviously men experience a kind of anxiety whenever we hear the word feminism, because obviously we have to give up our rights and our power and our privileges, that are exploitative, that are marginalizing women. That's obviously creating an anxiety in men. Also, it can, in my experience, that if a man says that I'm a feminist, there are chances that some women will feel puzzled that how can you be a feminist if you're a man, if that makes any sense. So I'm first recognizing, and there are no shortage of evidences that how the very word feminism creates an anxiety in men about our relationship with us and with women. At the same time, it can also, in some cases, what was like, I cannot be a feminist if I'm a man. And you are right, that the struggle cannot the the transformation is not possible by excluding men. They will have to be like we'll have to consider raising kids, boys with feminist perspective, understanding that what is on the other side. But on an anecdotal experience, I would say that obviously, if I have a daughter and a son, um, I would teach my son that you don't have to go and make cook food, but my daughter will have to go and cook. Like, and I'm not saying that that is my case, but I'm saying generally, stereotypically, like, oh, you go to the kitchen, and the boys, like, you work outside. I've read two or three articles, and yes, it in many ways, and it is not an easy story to deal with. So I would like to request you to talk about one of the stories where this girl in Russia, who wanted to continue her education, and in the end, she was murdered. So if you tell us the story, and how do you see it as a journalist?
You know, I mean, that's the thing. There are so many conversations to be had about feminism and what it means to men and women. But I think more than that, what we need here is just the basics, you know, like, and the story that you talked about. So this was a girl, and I said in the article that she was very much the ideal of like a Bangali middle class girl. You know, she was educated. She was very religious. She wore a headscarf and everything. Her father was a religious scholar. She got married into a family, and then her father died, and she was studying Islamic studies, and she finished her masters, and she wanted to sit for the BCS exams, get into the civil service. And at that point, her husband and his family said no, but she still insisted anyway. And then her mother just got a call one day saying that she lived in a different, her husband's family, they were in a different city to where her parents were. By this point, her father had passed away. Um, and she just got a call saying, yeah, she's sick. And by the time she got there, she just found her dead body. So a case which was lodged against this family, and as far as I know, the case has been like accepted by the court. It's being investigated. The husband, the mother-in-law, and the sister-in-law have been arrested. So, see, the mother-in-law and the sister-in-law have also been arrested, who very much, according to the first report, have also been accused of the murder, along with the husband. And the thing is, it's nowhere near. I mean, like you said, you've met Romana. It's nowhere near. When I was telling this story to a family member who's a faculty at Dhaka University, she also said, oh, I used to have a student, and the other people in the class told me that at her husband's house, she used to like lock herself up in the bathroom and study so that they wouldn't see that because she's neglecting her household duties for her education. So we've reached a point where we understand and accept that we want women to be part of the economy, to be educated, but only as individual economic units who are contributing to the family. But so it's become, in terms of kind of gender roles, it's become normalized for women to go out and do what we used to think were traditionally male roles of becoming the wage earner. But men have not taken on the traditional feminine role of, homemaking. And, there's this double burden on women. If you add poverty on top of that, that's like the triple burden, on women of like keeping it together. And we see that everywhere. And like the other thing that I find a lot during my work, and just I mean, I'm sure you've seen it too, if you just flip through the newspapers every day, or at least every other day, there will be a story of rape. There will always be a story. Yesterday, there was a story of um, an indigenous girl, a girl from the Marma community, who was raped, and the local chairman, instead of taking this to court, of filing a case under the existing law, which is actually a very good law, and there's also the sort of there's there's a center that rape victims can go to for processing, that these structures have actually been set up. But this chairman and the local political people, they decided to mediate it themselves, and they charged this man 10,000 taka, and they said, okay, fine, go off. And he he raped a child. Like, she was a minor as well. So this is what I mean. The way, you know, before I just think, like, yeah, we just need to. It's really frustrating how how we have dehumanized women to an extent where we just think, crimes as huge as rape, sexual violence, murder, whatever, are justified. Because the other thing that I wrote about, the article that you mentioned about Sumaya, the girl who died, the one who wanted to give the BCS exams, when the story broke, so many comments online were like, she was a girl from a religious family. Why did she not do as her husband told her? If she did not, if she wasn't trying to dream so big, then this wouldn't have happened to her. If she was a good wife, she should have listened to him and she should have stopped her education. So honestly, sometimes I just feel despair when I see this, when I think about what exactly is happening in the psychology of our society, that we don't even consider women to be human beings, that we think that husbands have the right to murder them. I don't know if you saw that there was a really horrible incident a few months ago of a man who murdered his wife on Facebook Live, and he said that she drove me crazy. And then there's so many people in the comments going like, oh, this poor man, she must have really been a bad wife. I mean, I know on Facebook you just find scum of society. So maybe that's an unfair representation, but it is very worrying. And I think we definitely have to think of ways on how to change these mindsets. And one thing that I thought of when I was reading that article is that, in Bangladesh we have Islamic Foundation, which is the government's arm of um, engaging in religious activities. And after the Holy Artisan attack, um, the Islamic Foundation, they took a really big initiative to educate people about radicalization. I can't concretely say how effective that was, but they did create these programs. They went to schools, they went to madrasas, they talked to people about how, what are the dangers, what is actually said in religion, how religion has never told you to go and like kill people and all that stuff. So if we can kind of take actions, take steps against radical thought, to try to prevent younger generations from being radicalized, why can't we use these same structures to talk to people about just the most basic thing, that a woman is not your property, that she's also a human being? And I think schools have also definitely failed in this respect, in educating. I mean, obviously, families have to do it as well, but I think in schools, it's high time that schools everywhere have, I don't know, some sort of course or something that makes people aware of like gender nuances, because we just need them. We need them really badly.
And you have spoken about it in the school system, and how in different places, how it is very easy for young people, particularly, to fall into a kind of like I think I think you have just mentioned in our conversation today that nowhere in the world the colonialism is possible without the local collaborator. And one of the objectives or the design of colonial education is to actually create collaborator. So to create collaborator is that you train them the mechanical process of reading and writing, not essentially thinking. And Brazilian education, Marxist education philosopher Paulo Freire, he has very brilliantly pointed that out, is that it's important that we learn to read the world. Literacy education is not about reading the word, because reading the word is very mechanical process, that B double like a book, N double like a nook, that's it. That doesn't help us to learn to read the world. And like anywhere in the world, I think Louis Althusser has said it, that how state as an ideological apparatus, like how it has to indoctrinate people in order to become a citizen and not to actually think critically. So that's that. And then the other story that I have read, shared with me. Sorry, I have one of the articles, that this Rohingya woman, how she came to Bangladesh, and then she was trying to find a way out of life. Went to India, and then her struggle. And can you talk about it and actually tease out, or like analyze some parts of it to understand the violence against women?
Well, I think that was a story about trafficking, right, of Rohingya refugees. And trafficking is another huge issue. Definitely, I mean, it happens to both men and women, but it definitely is a huge gendered issue for Bangladeshi and Rohingya women. In Bangladesh, we've had at some point last year, or was it? It was earlier this year, I think. Yeah, earlier this year there was this kind of mass movement of like female Bangladeshi migrant workers who were repatriated from Saudi Arabia. And they told so many horror stories, just so many horror stories of being abused, physically, sexually, psychologically tortured. Um, and in the same way, and in the refugee camps, I mean, this is like a whole, I mean, it's a really big and terrible issue. But yeah, in the refugee camps, people are obviously even more vulnerable to trafficking than Bangladeshi women, I would say, because they have no hope, like the situation is so terrible in Myanmar. Like the sort of, I mean, when you go work in the camps, like within a day, you will hear stories of the most gruesome sort of violence, and something that Myanmar completely denies, but it was brought up in the recent ICJ, the International Coastal Court of Justice proceedings that happened recently. The case that was lodged by Gambia, they said that the widespread campaign of sexual violence against Rohingya women, just using it as a tool of war, which Myanmar completely denied. But if you go to the refugee camps, you'll not even have to talk to too many people to realize that that is genuinely what happened. So these women are already traumatized, but they're also stuck in a place. I mean, obviously their lives are better in Bangladesh, and I just want to say here that this is also a very interesting debate, maybe for another time. But in Bangladesh, when the refugee exodus first happened in 2017, we welcomed these people with open arms because we felt we felt a lot of solidarity, and people were genuinely horrified by the way that they had genocide committed against them. But because for a number of reasons, their the refugee fatigue sticks, it just kind of sets in. It you know it's not possible for the government to host 1.1 million refugees indefinitely. It is the world's biggest refugee camp is Kutupalong, but it is still a cramped space, and people want better things for the younger generations, because there's so many people. A huge number of refugees are teenagers. They're just young girls and boys, and they have their whole lives to look forward to, but nothing to look forward to because so far there have been no solutions. There's no third country wants to repatriate them. Bangladesh obviously cannot host them indefinitely. Myanmar will not take them back. So where will they go? So in this place of hopelessness, a lot of people willingly try trafficking routes to get to countries like India, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and then they can work there. Sir, did you disappear?
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. My connection broke. I'm sorry. This happens. This happens. From time to time. I'm really sorry. Yeah. So anyway, তুমি বলতেছিলা যে মানে you are I have heard from the point, like after a certain time the refugee fatigue sets in. এতটুকু
Yes.
শুনেছি, এরপরে শুনিনি। হ্যাঁ।
So, I mean, obviously, there's a huge number of people who
হুম,
have, the rest of their lives to look forward to in the camps, but nothing to look forward to. So what they do try is
হুম, হুম,
they only use the trafficking routes
হুম,
um, to try and get to other countries. For young Rohingya girls, specifically, the the drive of marriage to a good Rohingya expat who does not live the life of a refugee. It's a big driver to using these trafficking routes, but obviously they're really dangerous. And I've met the families or women of like directly. I've met like 5 or 6 families, but I've heard stories of many more families where the girls get trafficked into sex slavery and their families just don't hear from them for like years and years. But the thing that happens is even when they're rescued, it it becomes an international problem, right? Because and the refugees who are registered in Bangladesh are usually refugees who've been registered in like the 90s. The more recent ones are unregistered refugees. So they are people who are stateless. So if they're rescued in India, there is no process. Their families may be in refugee camps in Bangladesh, but there's no process that they can use to try and be reunited with their families. So they are also, I mean, just think about, it really is the most tragic story, and I just find it so overwhelming and depressing that these women have ran away from genocide, have probably been victims of sexual violence in Myanmar, have never had access to any education, have had their movement restricted for most of their lives. They land in these refugee camps where they're so vulnerable. This one chance that their families try to get for them to escape, and they just fall into sex slavery. And then there's a possibility that they will never see their families again. What happens is sometimes they pay traffickers again to try and get trafficked back to whatever refugee camp their parents are in, because that's the only way open to them. But it's just So tragic, so vulnerable, and just yeah, it's horrible, horrible situation. And there are still so many women in the world who have to live this way. Like refugees are the most vulnerable people in the world, and in the way like migrant workers in like a lot of Bangladeshi migrant workers in Saudi Arabia have, at least, I mean, they have been, a majority of them have been repatriated to Bangladesh, but they also faced similar situations where they were just totally helpless, just totally at the mercy of someone who was abusing and using them. And it's really tragic that, in this day and age, women still have to face that.
Yeah, I mean, I had, I mean, your response and your perception, your insight into it. Um, I've lived 2 years in Saudi Arabia as worked as a guidance counselor, and having first-hand experience living in a place like Saudi Arabia, understanding that the kind of experiences Bangladeshi women go through in Saudi Arabia, especially women who go there for working as a domestic help, and I think it's more than due time. Like it has like over that when it's time that we become very vocal and unapologetic in not buy into any kind of apologetic discourse. To you know shy away from talking about the despicable, exploitation, experiences that Bangladeshi women experience in Saudi Arabia because of some kind of sentiment or belief system that I subscribe to. So, or anybody subscribe to. That it's time that we talk about it. Um,
I think we should also really, as a country, we should be very, very worried about the sort of values and ideologies that are being exported from countries like Saudi Arabia to Bangladesh. Because generally, you know, I know our constitution says that we're secular, but Bangladesh has always been a religious country, right? I'm sure you come from, almost all of us come from
yeah,
families who are religious, but the sort of
yeah.
very radical, um, like anti-women, racist, sort of like really kind of restrictive views that have emerged all over the world, because of radical political Islam, the Wahhabi movement, things like that. These are things that we should be very, very careful about because they're imported, they are not our they're not the religious values that we grew up with. So there's no reason for us to think that they are just the sort of values that we have always subscribed to. And we should be, if we are careful about being infected by liberal Western ideas, I think we should be equally careful about being infected by Saudi ideas.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. One question by probably your friend. You remember Farhan? That's a very good question. I'm nothing against feminism. In fact, I have had strong women around me growing up all my life, and I want women to progress even further. I want to be devil's advocate here and put it out there that all ideologies can have extreme viewpoints, even religion, for instance. Do you agree that there are extreme viewpoints in some cliques of feminism? And if so, how much do you think these extreme viewpoints contribute to negative impressions against feminism?
I think I'm not really certain what he means by extreme viewpoints. I'm assuming it's the whole like man hating sort of complex that women are better than men thing. I don't really think like if anyone was to actually try and go for a critical understanding of feminism and not just, I don't know, put feminism on their t-shirt and talk about it. I don't I think they will quite very quickly find that feminism like does not subscribe to that sort of extreme viewpoint. And there's a lot of like intersectionality, there's a lot of discussions around like race and class and society that is like very, very closely connected to feminism. But having said that, like, yeah, if these extreme views do exist, I think people on the receiving end of these views also have to understand them in their context. Like if I meet someone who's very, very radically religious and who says, you don't speak, don't, why is your hair not covered or whatever, I'm not going to turn around and think every single Muslim is like that. So no one, I don't think anyone should judge any sort of ideology based on the sort of fringe, radical, extreme views that come from it. And I think we just all have to be careful about that.
It's it's funny at the same time, relevant question. So where is Tasneem? Okay, here. Here, Tasneem doesn't want to wake the aunties. What do you say to that?
I mean, the aunties are the stereotypes of the gatekeepers, right? Like, I think that. But I always find it kind of, it is interesting that, so many things. And I think this is what I was going to say here that, we're talking about all these things and, how do we deal with it? And for me, the way that culture connects to gender and traditional values is very, very interesting. So there's a lot of things that seep into culture, right? That so now it's kind of like this whole like this auntie stereotype that we talk about, like your pashe bari auntie always poking her nose into your thing, which it's not a unfair stereotype to have because these people do exist. But I wonder why we don't have the same stereotype of like the creepy uncle as much. Because I mean we do, but there are, so I think in every sort of it's always an interesting exercise to look at how everything around you is gendered. And I don't really mean it in a negative sense, but it just kind of makes you think about these things more. And I just feel like when we're trying to sort of understand these things, culture and like all sorts of like, I don't know, literature, music, art, poetry, whatever. And this is a bit of a optimistic point of view and definitely not an academic point of view, but I feel like these are literally the only things that can save us, that can make us think about life differently, different gender relations. And I don't know, this is probably not relevant, but recently I discovered this African American female author called Lorraine Hansberry. I don't know if you've heard of her, but she's very niche. Like even I hadn't heard of her before. But I happened to like see a play of her and I looked her up and she was, like really, really hugely influenced by the philosophies of like Malcolm X and the sort of the suffragette movement and like a lot of things. And she wrote about, it's amazing because in just one work of in one play or like one novel, she has talked about sexism, she's talked about racism, she's talked about decolonization, she's talked about homosexuality, like she's talked about all these things, but instead of lecturing it, or like you said, like not instead of saying it in like a ivory tower academic boring context that makes the listener fall asleep, she has crafted this amazing story that keeps you hooked, and I feel like if anything that is the only way that we can get people to listen and learn, and the only way that we will get to also learn and kind of challenge the ways we think is by creating more culture.
Are you? I don't know if you are a fan of Amitav Ghosh, who writes historical novel. So he's an anthropologist by training, Bengali from India, and like I'm a huge fan of his work. So one of his last books is actually Gun Island, and I was never from the field of technology. My academic training has been in critical sociology, economics, in that field. But after going to Canada, as I needed to go through immigration and all of that, so I needed to work in tech sector for about 3 years, and that's my introduction to technology, and which I took very seriously subsequently in my research and understanding that how technology is cementing, advancing racism and sexism at a speed which should scare the life out of us, if you actually dig into it. In his book, he connects racism, sexism, climate crisis, artificial intelligence, how the global economy is actually collapsing, and incredibly compelling story. So I had the chance to meet him at UFT, University of Toronto, And I asked him that how, I mean, you talk about animals' right, you talk about women's right, you talk about trafficking, you talk about algorithm, you talk all of this in one book. Like, why do you bring all of this like in one book? And there he gave a compelling answer. Tell me, you may be living in Bangladesh, in Dhaka right now. Are you away from the ecological crisis? What is happening in the world? Are you not impacted by it? When there is a technological disruption, is it not impacting your life? I mean, so that holistic perspective is incredibly important. I think one of the other severe limitations of colonial education is that it wants us to focus in once. We know more and more about less and less, and that's why each of our discipline becomes the world. Like if I'm trained in anthropology, that's the worldview is, and I don't want to hear from anybody else. But the world works as intricate and interconnected system. So we're towards the end of our conversation. I want to ask, and I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot here. Um, you grew up in a kind of family which is not a common, women's experience. If I think about it, in the most Bangladeshi women in Bangladesh. Um, but I don't think even growing up in a relatively well-off family or in a bit of like having a bit of privilege, I don't think you spent your entire life not realizing that you are a girl, like early on, and then a woman, etc. Right? How did your family has influenced your perception about gender relationship, and how do you view it? Like looking back, and um, if you can speak to that.
Interesting. I think personally, I think, like you said, I'm very aware of the sort of privilege that I've been born with, but I think the other really great privilege that I had is that I've had amazing. My grandmothers played a really, really big, important role in my life as kind of female role models. So both of my grandmothers were teachers. Like I said, my daddy was. She was one of like the from her district. I think she was the first woman who went to university. She actually went to Kolkata when she was like, you know, barely just a teenager, and went to Lady Brabourne College and studied, did her master's later and everything. My nanny also, I actually came from late, and she also like she finished her master's after she had had like her first three children or something like that, but she still did that. And she went on to become a teenager, and then later on she actually edited a magazine. She used to write a lot, so I think I've always looked up to her for that, and she's been my inspiration. um, my mother is a doctor, and I think my mom's side of the family is what you would call a very typical Bangladeshi middle class family. My nana was very religious. He, studied Islamic studies. He was in government service, and he had five daughters, and he insisted that every single one of them had to finish university. And when my eldest aunt, who passed away recently actually, when she got married without finishing her degree, he was so upset that he refused to go to the wedding. So I think, so in a way, I'm very, very privileged because I come from a sort of background where not studying was not an option. Like I felt a pressure to, like, you have to continue this legacy, you have to be educated, you have to be working. And I'm very, very lucky that I've always had really strong working educated women in my life who's kind of cleared this path and made it very, very easy for me. um, but I think on the other hand, the other thing that's been really good for me on a personal level is that my mother and my grandmothers, when they were around, they were also, especially my mother, because by that time, when I was older, by the time I was, in my early 20s, both my grandmothers have passed away. But she's always been, I mean, there has always been a certain level of resistance, but at the end of the day, she's always been very open to accepting my ideas. So there's it started with friction. Like there were definitely like things like you can't do this and you can't do that. But when I negotiated, when I said, times have changed, this, that, I was not shut down. Like I was allowed to have my say. And I think, I mean, not to not to just make my family sound like the best in the world, but I think, I think that's the greatest gift that any girl can have, just having that space to have her opinion, to just air her opinions out, to be heard is really, really important. And once you're heard, you end up after a while influencing your family in the way that they have also influenced you.
Yeah, 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 Suprova, thank you very much. That's, I mean, that was a wonderful, wonderful answer, and not. I think a lot of the times I often say to a lot of my friends that there's one thing about having privilege is that we don't see it, but once you don't have it, you realize that I don't have them. So not everybody feels comfortable talking about their privileges, um, but without recognizing it, I don't think one can talk about their positionality. So you have started our conversation from the very beginning, talking about your own in cases wherever it was applicable about your privileged positions. Um, that is important to have critical conversation. Shubhava, thank you very much. We had a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and I probably have mentioned this to you before that this conversations are actually used to promote critical literacy. So this is going to live in the web, and that we have World School of Bangladesh. So one of the reasons, I mean, we have talked about it already in this conversation, that in a formal education setup, critical literacy is not always promoted. Either you can give it an we are pushed for time, you have to finish syllabus, and etc., and so on and so forth. But if we don't learn to think, um, that is going to be one of the biggest burden on us. Like, how do I see? Um, One of my favorite writers of all time, James Baldwin, he has once written that once a victim can articulate what is the reason of their subjectivity, they no longer remain a victim. They transform into a threat to the oppressor, right? So I don't think understanding subjectivity is that easy, and we're not very welcoming to have critical conversation. So in spaces like that, where you have been generous with your time and participating in this conversation, but I do have to mention this to you, is that this is only the beginning of our conversation, and we really, I mean, I'm not saying that because I have known you for a long time, requesting you that in future to also be part of this platform and promote critical conversation, where I don't know if you have noticed from the beginning of our conversation the kind of engagement that was, and whenever we have talked about women's issue, we would say one of the highest engagement comes from when this sort of issues are talked about. So thank you very much for being part of that, and we look forward to have more conversations with you in future.
Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me. I hope we haven't bored people who have tuned in, and like it's really, really amazing what you're doing, and I'd be happy to be a part of it anyway. So thank you.
Thank you so much, audience, for listening, and the great questions from everybody. We will end here, and Shubhava, once again, thank you. 1 second, Shubhava.